There is this myth that the English came to Ireland and just banned the Irish language, forcing the locals to speak English more or less at gunpoint, and the Irish basically adopted almost a Creole, using modern English words with pronunciation and grammar from the local Gaelic or Irish language. Reality, however, is a lot more complicated than that. If that story were true, then why do some things exist in Hiberno-English, that is, English spoken in Ireland, that don't exist in either Gaelic or modern English? And why is English in Dublin or Northern Ireland different from the rest of the country? Well, in this video we're going to find out how English became the dominant language in Ireland and where the Irish accent comes from. English first came to Ireland around the 12th century when Irish lords invited lords in England to come and help them reclaim or take lands from other Irish lords. With the help of wealth built up in Britain and France, these rulers would eventually come to dominate large parts of Ireland while swearing at least a nominal loyalty to the King of England. However, despite the domination of these lords in various parts of the country and despite popular belief, this is not when English came to replace Gaelic in Ireland. For a start, the dominant language of the upper nobility in England at the time was actually French, not English, and though most of those who came to settle in Ireland spoke English, this still reduced its influence somewhat, with some important documents written in Ireland at the time being written in French. But more importantly, settlers did not come in large numbers. With some exceptions that we'll get to, no permanently English-speaking communities were established at this time, so the subjects of these lords were entirely Irish Gaelic-speaking, meaning a certain knowledge of Irish would have been needed just for administrative purposes. In fact, these leaders often allied with local Irish leaders in times of battle and had to communicate somehow. Add to that the fact that England itself was going through periods of war and political turmoil, and just the mere difficulty of communication at that time, both of which meant that reinforcement of English was impossible. As a result, these lords had next to no major impact on the mainstream local culture of the time. In fact, it was these lords who adopted the local culture rather than the other way around, so much so that they became known as more Irish than the Irish themselves, and soon became Irish-speaking like their subjects. This is why the Irish accent is not like Middle English, the type spoken at the time, and is much more similar to modern English. That is, apart from the exception of certain cities and towns on the east coast, especially Dublin and Waterford. These places were conquered early, and unlike the countryside, did in fact keep close political and cultural ties with England and later Britain. From this period on, they were never ruled by Irish-speaking lords, and are the one place in Ireland which did establish an English-speaking community, one which has survived to the present day. And this is why we do in fact see some aspects of Middle English in these accents. For example, the famous Dublin U, like in the city name itself. Dublin, as opposed to
Dublin
in Britain, or
Dublin
in the rest of Ireland. There was also the dropping of certain letters at the end of words, such as this word being pronounced Pown. Not all of Dublin English comes from this time, however, and in fact even in Dublin the influence from this period is relatively small, which I will get to later. The real phase shift for English in Ireland, however, began with the Tudor monarchs in England, who had finally established a bit of stability in their own kingdom and were now eager to spread their rule to Ireland. This led to a series of wars between the invading English and both Gaelic Irish and those whose ancestors had arrived beginning in the 12th century, known as the Old English. Victories for the invaders changed the cultural situation in Ireland forever. Previously dominant lords lost a lot of power and lands, and Gaelic customs lost patrons and prestige and began to fade as a result, being gradually replaced by English customs. Not only that, but many native lords physically left the country in what became known as the Flight of the Earls. And then on top of that was what were known as the plantations. This is where loyal English and Scottish people would be planted on or given lands formerly owned by the now dispossessed or fled Irish. These planters were initially prevented from having Irish tenants or adapting Irish culture in order to keep a community of loyal British residents in the country. So for the first time, other than in the cities, there was now a relatively stable, reasonably sized population of English speakers in Ireland. And not just English speakers, Scots in the form of Ulster Scots, which is still spoken today, also developed a community at this time. And this is the real beginning of the main rural Irish accents. The plantations happened in two phases. The first were the Munster plantations, which brought English speakers, especially from the southwest of English, to various counties in the centre and south of Ireland. And then the more successful Ulster plantations, which brought planters from Scotland and northern England to settle the province of Ulster. This period of settlement would be the basis of the two main accents in Ireland today. English spoken at this time was early modern English, which explains why the Irish accent does not sound completely different to modern English, and why certain language features exist in the Irish dialects but not in Gaelic or modern English. A good example is the R sound. In Gaelic, the R sound is expressed as a tap, like in this word, scunra, which means terror, while in modern English that sound is usually left out altogether, such as this word being pronounced fam, but in Ireland it is pronounced always, but not like in Gaelic. for example, farm. Another example is the numerous diphthongs which have developed in modern English and don't exist in Gaelic, but in traditional Hiberno-English accents have kept their early modern nature. For example, the word lame, which remained this sound in Ireland, lame. But these movements were still not enough to replace Gaelic. The plantations brought a community of English speakers which has survived to this day, but they were still greatly outnumbered by Irish speakers. They, like the Old English before them, still interacted regularly with the native Irish, and even spoke the native language in some instances. To truly replace Irish, another phase shift was required. The first part of this came in 1830 with the National Schools Act, which introduced compulsory primary education around the country, education that was entirely in English. However, this education was mostly administered by the Catholic Church, who would have mostly been middle-class Irish speakers. So you now have a situation where huge masses of young people are being taught in English as a second language by others who spoke English as a second language, and English influenced by that English which they heard spoken by the planter communities. Add to this various famines, including the Great Famine, which depopulated Irish-speaking rural communities, and more dispossession caused by social upheaval and rebellions, and after a century or two, a heavily Gaelic-influenced English became the dominant language of the country, with that in the northeast also heavily influenced by Scots. We can see this rapid progression in the maps now on screen. Some examples of the Gaelic influence on Hiberno-English are the letter A in words like this,
apt,
as pronounced in Britain, but in Ireland as apt, or the widely known pronunciation of th, which in Southern Irish dialects is pronounced as so. For example, that, pronounced as dat, or thin as tin. There was also a heavy influence on grammar with phrases like I have great hunger on me, or the present continuous tense, he does be in the yard most days, which don't exist in other forms of English. And that brings me back to Dublin. Throughout this period, Dublin was the administrative capital of the country and retained a relatively close connection with Britain, with many soldiers and government workers from Britain being stationed in the country throughout these decades. This ensured that the dialect here did not become a new offshoot of Middle English and instead stayed close to modern English, while still developing relatively independently of other Irish dialects. Some marks from this period being Dubliners less likely to pronounce their R's, for example this word being pronounced as forced, or the glottal stop, like in this word, pronounced bottle, features in modern British English but not present in Irish English or Gaelic. But our story does not end there. The one constant in language is change, and the Irish accent has continued to evolve until today. In the 1920s, the southern two-thirds of Ireland became independent and two language communities formed, one in the Republic of Ireland and one in Northern Ireland. The northern dialects have undergone only slight changes, with not enough dialect mixing to change things greatly. Meanwhile, in the south, waves of urban to rural migration beginning before independence led to a new accent in Dublin city. These new migrants, many of whom became middle class, mixed their dialects with the local one to create what is known as the New Dublin dialect. This accent became that of the higher classes in the city and began to be heard in the richest parts of the capital and on the television and radio. With the spread of these media and its high prestige nature, the influence of this new accent began to then spread across the Republic, and another new accent was formed, the supra-regional Irish accent, with similarities to the New Dublin dialect but maintaining a stronger influence from rural areas. This super-regional dialect is incidentally the one that I am using in this video. As well as the influence from rural migrants, this accent would also be heavily influenced by British English, which, despite independence, retained much influence in Ireland and became ever more prominent as British media became widespread in Ireland, alongside native media. An example of this influence is the diphthongs in words like now or show, which don't exist in other Irish accents, or the many words and phrases which were once common in Hiberno-English that are now less common or have disappeared, such as tack, as in the phrase you haven't a tack on you, meaning you are very thin or don't have enough clothes on you to stay warm, or spútrach, meaning soaking wet. As this super-regional accent is the one used in media and by influential people, this has become the new standard accent in the Republic of Ireland, with Northern Ireland maintaining its previous accent, with some standardising around the Belfast dialect, which played a similar role to Dublin for Northern Ireland, though to a lesser degree. And of course we can't forget the influence of American English, which influences the world through global culture, with some Irish people so influenced by this culture that they themselves grow up with an American accent rather than an Irish one. And as we go into the future, other changes are sure to come, possibly new features we could never have predicted, and certainly further influence from other dialects as our world continues to globalise. I hope you enjoyed this brief overview of the Irish accent. Of course, there are many more local accents in Ireland that I couldn't get to, variously influenced by the Gaelic previously spoken in that area and the settlers who came there later. Let me know in the comments how your accent is different. Thanks for watching. If you liked this video, you can leave a thumbs up below. or you can watch some of the other videos I've made, or subscribe to be informed about new videos.